Okay, so basically, the topic of my paper today and tomorrow is it's Feminism, Internationalism and Marxism after 1989, and tomorrow I'll be primarily talking a bit more about Marxism and what that might mean today in relation to feminism and in relation to politics. But today is going to be mostly a very depressing account of the use and abuse of certain words relating to feminism, including feminism, the way in which neoliberalism, or whatever you want to call it, has co-opted certain dimensions of the feminist project. So I'm basing today's lecture on these books, which I put on the reading list, but I sent the list off quite late, so I don't know if many of you had a chance to read them. Doesn't matter. But I'll summarise some of their arguments. So basically, Angela McRobbie, Hester Eisenstein, but mostly Nancy Fraser, who I'm sure most of you are familiar with for her work on reparations, etc. But the work I'm going to be looking at of Nancy Fraser's is a recent piece she wrote about second-wave feminism and the ways in which it's been co-opted in certain specific ways. So I'm not going to try to make any grand claims about the relationship between East and West, which has obviously been a big topic of discussion so far, and I won't really be talking about communism, pre-existing socialism and so on, although we can discuss this afterwards. I'd be very interested to know what people might say in relation to some of the claims I'm making about imperialism, neo-imperialism and so on. Okay, so the first part of my presentation concerns the ways in which feminism as a term and as a series of projects has been co-opted, assimilated and undermined in central ways by certain political currents in recent decades. So I'll be reading, as I said, Nancy Fraser's key recent article, Feminism, Capitalism and the Cunning of History, from 2009, and also Hester Eisenstein's book, Feminism Seduced, also 2009, and some of the claims by Angela McRobbie in the aftermath of feminism, also 2009. Something happened in 2009 in which everyone was worried about the direction feminism was going in, understandably, given particularly its use in justifying war in Iraq and Afghanistan under the guise of the liberation of women, which I'll talk about a bit more partly under this guise. At least this was used as political rhetoric. Okay, so I'll outline some of the main points for discussion, and obviously I'd like this to be more discursive. I don't want to talk for 2 hours, so I'll maybe keep it 45 minutes, an hour of me talking, and then hopefully an interesting discussion. Okay, so to try in the first place to indicate some of the difficulties with the topic, my topic, Feminism, Internationalism and Marxism, but as I say, the Marxism will be tomorrow, and that will be the more, hopefully, positive part. And tomorrow I'll also be talking about terms which have come back into vogue, or come back into fashion in certain ways, such as the commons, and in relation to how we understand ideas of immaterial or effective labour, which are also terms discussed quite frequently today, not unproblematically, and a lot of times they're drawn from earlier feminist work on the effective dimensions of existence, emotional labour, care work, etc. Okay, so these are the kind of difficulties. I think for all of these writers, so American and British writers here, a lot of what they're doing is coming to terms with their own relation to feminism, having, for them all been working as feminist activists and feminist writers and feminist teachers for a long time. As in Fraser's words, as looking back over second-wave feminism, and we can discuss whether we call it second-wave feminism or not, all of them, in a way, use it as a kind of shorthand for a series of projects. So Fraser, in particular, wants to understand second-wave feminism as, quote, an ethical social phenomenon. So she's looking at it kind of as a sort of total thing, really, and not only its aims and ambitions, but also whether it achieved them, and more specifically how some of its desires became co-opted and became part of the neoliberal project, which is the really serious concern here. What's left of feminism that we can, save for a kind of collective, useful, positive political project. So all three of the writers are looking at attempt to configure the relationship between different tendencies and shifts within capitalism after the post-war period, and under the new spirit of capitalism, which Fraser takes up, or neoliberalism, as Fraser also describes it, under the regime of globalized corporate capitalism, as Eisenstein describes it, and as, quote, the current global and still patriarchal system of economic power and domination, as McRobbie described it. So they all, in a way, have a similar kind of description of the current kind of economic and cultural climate. Okay, so these points I'm just going to outline. There's about 5 worries and concerns that these writers have. Some of them are quite similar to one another. Okay, so the first one is, as Fraser puts it, the quote, the disturbing convergence of some of the ideals of second-wave feminism, which Fraser sees emerging from the, quote, anti-imperialist new left, with the demands of, quote, an emerging new form of capitalism, post-Fordist, disorganised, transnational. I'll come back to this word transnational later. Eisenstein similarly puts this in the following way. Quote, the feminist revolution of the 1960s and 70s was undergirded by the demands of the capitalist economy for women's labour. Okay, so all of them, but particularly Eisenstein, I think, are looking at this, what happened to feminism, basically, second-wave feminism, in the context of the mass influx of women into the labour force in a global context. Okay, and obviously the asymmetrical way in which women's work is played out across the world. Okay, so 2, Fraser notes the cultural success of second-wave feminism combined with its relative failure to transform institutions. Okay, so she makes a separation between a kind of cultural dissemination and acceptance of certain feminist ideas and images and models, with a relative limitation of how effective these ideas have been, right? So on the one hand, you have a kind of generalised understanding of what feminist aims and ideas are, and even like lip service paid to them in general, and not just lip service. I mean legal reforms and so on about discrimination in the workplace, etc., etc. But a kind of a limitation, which is a structural limitation of how far feminism got in a certain way. Okay, so Fraser here is referring to the relatively widespread acceptance at one level of critiques originating in feminist activism and theory regarding unequal pay, sexual harassment, and so on, without the actual total elimination of such practices. Okay, obviously things are much better in this regard, but they're not total, right? So even people who would say, of course it's wrong to sexually harass at work will be incredibly misogynist and patronising and sexist on occasion, just anecdotally. Okay, so in a sense, to put it even more simply, changing people's minds has not yet led them to changing their behaviour. And I think there's a kind of parallel and sort of structural similarity with a link to racism, particularly with regard to the police. So, for example, in Britain, after a very famous racist murder of a young black student called Stephen Lawrence, the police admitted, and nobody was found guilty basically, and the police were accused of not really bothering to do their research. The police admitted that they were institutionally racist. Okay, so they said that we have a structural problem with racism. But this admission did nothing to change their practice. Right? So in a way it became a kind of smokescreen. Right? So you can say, look, as a body or as an institution, we have a problem with sexism, yes, we have a problem with racism. But it doesn't actually map onto any real transformation in those structures. So in a way, one of the problems I have, the issues that we all have is the use and abuse of language. Okay, what does it mean to say, yes, we have a problem with sexism, to use those words, but not to do anything really about it, right? Because in a way, these problems are obviously part of broader structures that relate to capitalism, and in a sense, it's a kind of smokescreen to kind of isolate these things in some ways. Okay, so Fraser notes that this simple version, an optimistic version of the separation between culture and institutions would be the idea of progress and catch-up. Okay, so she could say, well, one way of looking at this would be to say, okay, we've got a transformation at the level of culture, so most people accept feminist ideas at some level, and let's just wait for institutions to catch up. It's a kind of passive reformism or something like this, right? This is one way of maybe understanding this relation, right? Why haven't these ideas really come into practice? Well, maybe it's just a question of time. Fraser is understandably sceptical of this idea, noting that this optimistic version, this passive reformism, we could say, may, quote, obscure a more complex, disturbing possibility that the diffusion of cultural attitudes born out of the second wave has been part and parcel of another social transformation, unanticipated and unintended by feminist activists, a transformation in the social organisation of post-war capitalism. So in a way, it's for her and for others, it's not enough simply to look at institutions right, without understanding the relation to capitalism more broadly. Okay, Fraser goes even further, I would say, than mere pessimism about this catch-up, passive reformist idea. Instead, she hypothesizes, quote, the disturbing possibility that the cultural changes jump-started by the second wave have actually served to legitimate a structural transformation of capitalist society that runs directly counter to feminist visions of a just society. And in a way, this is her kind of major argument, that, as Eisenstein says as well, there's been an unwitting complicity or congruence or strange parallelism, some mutual reinforcement of certain feminist second wave ideas with certain key transformations in post-war capitalism. And I'll note them in more detail in a minute. It should be noted, for the purposes of this discussion in this context, and to my paper, which directly refers to 1989 in the title, that Fraser argues that it wasn't until after 1989 that second-wave feminism emerged as a political force in what were by then ex-communist countries, right? And I'm not sure of the veracity of this claim, right? She's saying basically, that okay, we talk about second-wave feminism if we want to use this term as beginning in non-communist countries in the late 60s and early 70s, and Fraser is saying that actually, these ideas don't emerge until after 1989 in ex-communist countries, which I'm dubious about. Okay, one of the other issues here is this term gender. I think talking about language, obviously some of the discussions I've heard, people are quite sceptical in some sense of words like transition and so on, and I think here that the term gender, obviously we're the gender studies thing, but for these thinkers, but particularly Eisenstein, there's a real skepticism about the way in which gender has been used, particularly in an institutional context, going back to this idea of institutions, and in the broader economic and cultural climate. So Eisenstein, on this particular term, on gender, she says, no matter how begrudgingly state, academic and corporate structures have been able to make way for the demands of gender, gender has been a more malleable feature of public life than either race or class. Okay, so there's a sense in which, moving beyond the discussion of race and class to gender has, in a way, been the acceptable face of a certain kind of discussion, she's arguing. Right, so, and again, talking about this idea of smoke screens or obscuring certain real problems, real fundamental structural problems. Again, so gender may be one of these kind of ideas, and we can talk about this afterwards. Okay, further on this point of the language and rhetoric of feminism, the worry here is that, again, it's kind of being open to abuse. So particular words that are now seen as sort of integral to the feminist project, so freedom, integral to like a democratic project, any kind of project really. So freedom, also empowerment. Okay, why are these problematic words? Well, okay, as Eisenstein puts it, the freedom, in inverted commas, experienced by women in the developed world becomes a selling